Welcome to a tutorial video on Bootstrap. In this video, I'm going to talk about buttons. When we talk about buttons in Bootstrap, there are two basic categories we need to think of. The first of which is the common HTML button. We can use the button element to create buttons. The second, and this is unique to Bootstrap, is that we can use other elements by applying the BTN, the button class, to those elements to create the presentation of buttons. So, there are two categories. Buttons that are HTML buttons, and buttons that are in fact other elements that act like buttons in Bootstrap. So these are the two categories we need to keep in mind. So I mentioned the class BTN. This is the prefix class whenever we use buttons within Bootstrap. So coming down here on line 14, you see this first section here called buttons. And you'll notice I'm using the button HTML element. However, in each case, I'm using the BTN class. This is the button class within Bootstrap. After that, similar to when we were talking about alerts in the previous video, and borders even before that in the previous video before that, we use color names here to define the color and presentation of these buttons. And we're moving, as I mentioned in the previous video with alerts and those components, in greater specificity. So first we define the button class, that we're using it, and next we define that we're using the button and then its color name. So BTN for button, then BTN hyphen and the color name. So in this case, to create a primary button following the primary color usage here, we have primary right here, and it is the button HTML element, the type following through is button, the classes is BTN, and then BTN primary, moving in specificity from the initial component to its visual composition. So BTN to tell Bootstrap this is a button, we want it presented as a button using the Bootstrap rules, and then we want BTN primary to create a button using the primary presentation, whatever those colors are. And we can also do this with the other color categories: secondary, success, danger, warning, info, light, and dark. In all cases, we're using the button HTML element and then applying the BTN Bootstrap class and then BTN hyphen something. BTN again is the prefix of the button class, and you'll see these multiple times as I go through these examples. But to create very basic buttons, you can use the button HTML element and then give it the class BTN, telling it it's a button, and then BTN hyphen and the color category to make your buttons match those color categories. Now, that BTN prefix I've mentioned a number of times here is important because it's going to be talked about as we move through the rest of these examples, and it will appear again and again. In Bootstrap, similar to when we're talking about alerts and talking about borders, they act as prefix classes. So we have BTN hyphen something, and that'll let us know that we want to use one of the built-in classes within Bootstrap to style our buttons in a certain way. In these examples, we're using color categories. In the next set of examples, we're going to be looking at sizes. So let's move down to that. I've now moved down to line 24, and this is a new section. For these right here, again, we're using the button HTML element. Its type is button, and then the class is BTN, because these are buttons. Then we're using BTN primary, and then we're using something new. So there are three basic sizes within Bootstrap for buttons: large LG, small SM, and normal or block, which will fill up the available space. And we use a block size. So we see here BTN-LG. Again, I mentioned the BTN prefix class is important. So to create a large button, it's BTN for button, BTN primary if we want to use those color schemes, and BTN-LG for large. And we see it's right here, a large button. Right underneath that, in this code, but appearing next to it over here, is small. That's SM. Again, coming back to use of that prefix. BTN-LG for large, BTN-SM for small. Finally, I mentioned the third size we can use here is block, BTN-block. This fills up all available space given to it. So in this example, if I expand this, we see the button also expands all the way up to fill its all available space. This is the button size. And in each case, BTN and the name of the size, similar to BTN and name of the color, and we're moving in specificity, and it helps us towards our design. BTN for button, then BTN and the design or size or color we want to use after that. Moving in specificity and helping us think through design problems here. So let's move from colors, from sizes, to start talking about states. When we start to talk about things we can interact with, we need to be aware and start to realize that our users are going to interact with these things. That is, they're things that the user can interact with, they're going to interact with them. So we need to be aware of their states. Now, when I use that term, there are two basic states within interactive elements. They are either active or they're disabled. That is, the user can interact with them in some way, they can click on them, or they can move them or something, or they're disabled, that is, they can't be moved, they can't be interacted with. These are the two primary states. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning of this video that we can use the BTN, the button class, to make other elements other than the button HTML element appear as buttons within Bootstrap. Right here under states, starting on line 29, is an example of that. This right here is a hyperlink. This right here, it says primary link. It's a hyperlink, notice a hyperreference, but it's acting as if it is a button. This is where Bootstrap becomes incredibly powerful with its components of buttons. So we can use the button class, apply it to another element, and make that element appear as a button. This gives us a large degree of flexibility when designing different things and thinking about layout concerns. We can use the button HTML element, or we can use other elements and apply that BTN class to make them buttons. And you see that's what I've done right here. This is a hyperlink, but it has the class BTN, defining it as a button, BTN primary, using the primary category of color, BTN large, making it a large button, and then active. This is those two states, either active or disabled. And you see, notice right after this, role equals button. We talked about this in the previous video. When using alerts, we were defining an element as a role equals alert. This is the same idea again. This is an element that's acting as a button, and so its role is button. And we need to tell Bootstrap that. So we apply an attribute, role equals, and then the name of the thing we want it acting as. In this case, acting as a button, role equals button. Notice right here, aria pressed equals true. This is where we start to get into accessibility concerns. The aria attributes are special attributes we can apply to elements to give screen readers and other accessibility tools information about what this is supposed to be. Notice when I said that we can make elements into buttons, well, we have to add extra information to help screen readers and other accessibility tools know what these are. So because they're elements that are acting as buttons, we have to give that little bit of extra information. And the Bootstrap documentation goes into more detail about this, and I encourage people to go look at it, but the very basic here, if we have an element that's acting in the role of a button, we need that extra information right here, this extra attribute, to let screen readers and other accessibility tools know that yes, this is something that can be pressed. It's a button, so it can be clicked or pressed or something like that. So in these two cases, we have active and we have active. Notice right here, the active state, and we could click on one of these. And then underneath that, we have the other state, which is disabled. Now, when we apply the active class, we can make a button active if it isn't already, and it usually is by default. However, for the button HTML element, we don't apply the disabled class, we apply the disabled element. And this makes the difference between when we're using the HTML button or using an element that's acting as a button. These are the two main differences, especially when it comes to applying the disabled status. So right here we see because we're using the button HTML element, we're using the disabled attribute. So we apply the disabled attribute. Or if we have elements that are acting as buttons, then we apply this disabled class. And that's why these two become important and how we're dealing with them. If we're dealing with the button HTML element, we can apply the disabled attribute and it will make it disabled. These right here. Or down here, if we're dealing with elements that are acting as buttons, we apply the disabled class and it works the same way. Notice though, we also have this additional attribute to help with screen reading and other accessibility tools. And we have to apply these to help our other users be aware of this. Notice if we have elements that are acting as buttons and we want them to be active, we apply aria press true. If we want to be disabled, aria disabled true. These are the two attributes we apply when we have elements that are acting as buttons. So, in this video I've covered buttons in part of Bootstrap. And we realized we can use the button HTML element within Bootstrap. And we apply that through the BTN class. And then we can apply BTN-primary to use any of the color categories: primary, success, danger, warning, info, light, and dark, and stylize our buttons in those manners. So BTN is the base class, and then we can add greater specificity by adding more classes. BTN-primary to use the color scheme primary. In sizes, we saw that we also follow that same schema of using BTN prefix. Similar to BTN primary, we saw BTN large, BTN small, BTN block of LG, SM, and block. So in all of these cases, we just move in specificity between the base class to the color scheme we want, to the size we want, in each case using that BTN prefix for button. And we saw we can make them large, we can make them small, or give them block status that fills up all available space. Finally, when we started talking about states, we started getting into how we can have elements act as buttons. But the two important information we need to use when we're doing that is making sure the role is set to button. This is similar to when we were using alerts in the previous video. We're going to set that role to whatever it's acting as. It's acting as a button, its role needs to be button. We also need to include this extra information for screen readers and other accessibility tools to let them know this is an element acting as a button. Here's that extra information to help you. And then we saw down here for the disabled state that we use a disabled attribute for the button HTML element, and we use a disabled class for elements that are acting as buttons. Thanks for watching.